Since 2010, the amount of computing power used to train the largest AI systems has roughly doubled every few months. And for one stretch between 2012 and 2018, it grew by a factor of roughly 300,000. That is not a typo, and it is not marketing. It is the raw fuel number behind everything that has happened in artificial intelligence over the last 3 years, and it is the reason the world suddenly feels like it flipped a switch. You did not imagine it. Something actually changed, and it changed at a speed almost no other technology in history has matched. Here is why that number matters to you personally, not just as a headline. More computing power does not automatically make a system smarter, but it is the substrate that allows breakthroughs to happen faster than institutions can adapt to them. Models today can hit strong performance on serious cognitive tasks while being dramatically smaller and cheaper to run than the systems from just a few years ago. On difficult benchmarks in mathematics and coding, machine performance has moved from something close to random guessing to matching or exceeding skilled human experts. And it did that in under a decade. That is the part most people are not fully pricing in. This is not a distant future problem. It is already inside the economy, quietly rearranging who gets hired, who gets funded, and who gets replaced. So let's back up and ask the obvious question. If the technology is moving this fast, what happens to the people whose income depends on doing the tasks it now does? Multiple independent estimates converge on an uncomfortable answer. Widely cited analysis has put the number of jobs at risk of automation-driven disruption in the tens of millions in the United States alone by the end of this decade. And a major financial institution's own research has estimated that on the order of 300 million full-time jobs globally could be meaningfully affected by generative AI and related automation. These are not fringe predictions from doom bloggers. They are coming from the same institutions that are simultaneously building and funding the technology. What makes this transition different from earlier waves of automation is that it is not confined to one sector. Physical automation replaced factory labor. This wave reaches into knowledge work. So language systems can now draft, summarize, analyze, and plan. Vision systems can inspect, classify, and generate. Robotics is slowly absorbing more physical tasks every year. Individually, each of these tools still looks narrow, imperfect, occasionally clumsy. That is exactly why so many people underestimate what is happening. The danger was never any single tool being perfect. The danger is that together, these imperfect tools now form a stack capable of doing large portions of what used to require a team of trained humans at a fraction of the cost and without needing sleep, benefits, or a career path. Capital notices this faster than labor does because capital is the side making the decision. When a company can deploy a system instead of hiring a person, and that system gets a little better every quarter while the person's salary only goes up, the economic logic tilts hard and it tilts permanently. This is not a temporary dip that reverses when growth returns. It is a structural shift in what labor is worth relative to what machines and the capital behind them are worth. And once that shift takes hold inside enough companies, it stops being a controversial prediction and starts being how the economy actually runs. Follow that logic all the way to its endpoint, and you land somewhere genuinely strange. If machines can perform most economically important tasks better and cheaper than people, then human labor stops being necessary for the system to function. That is a harder sentence to sit with than it sounds. For the last 2 centuries, the economy needed ordinary people, not out of generosity, but because it needed workers to produce things and consumers to buy them. Take away the need for mass labor, and you eventually take away the economic reason to care about mass income. Fewer people earning a wage means fewer people spending, and an economy that used to be built around consumer demand starts drifting toward one built around a small set of owners, operators, and the infrastructure that serves them. You do not have to imagine this happening in the distant future because pieces of it are already visible right now, and one of the clearest examples is sitting in your monthly power bill. In 2024, data centers running AI workloads consumed something on the order of 4% of total electricity in the United States. Projections for the back half of this decade put the figure anywhere from roughly 7 to 12%, depending on how fast deployment continues. That is an enormous claim on a finite resource, and it has to come from somewhere. In 2025, average household electricity prices in the United States rose more than 5%, and in regions clustered near large data center buildouts, prices have climbed far more sharply, in some documented cases more than doubling compared to 5 years earlier. The infrastructure that used to be built primarily to power homes is quietly being re-engineered to power machines first, and the cost of that shift is being passed down to the people who live near it, whether or not they ever asked for it. Read that pattern carefully, because it is a preview of a much bigger dynamic. When an economic system starts prioritizing the resources that serve machines over the resources that serve people, that is not an accident of engineering. It is a signal about where value and priority are actually flowing, regardless of what anyone says publicly about jobs being safe or automation being gradual. The public message and the capital allocation do not have to agree. And right now, in a lot of places, they clearly do not. So where does that leave the idea of a permanent underclass? And is that framing exaggeration, or is it a reasonable extrapolation? If a large share of the population is no longer economically necessary as workers, and if that same population increasingly cannot participate as major consumers either, the honest answer is that a system built purely on efficiency has no built-in mechanism to keep caring about them. Ownership of the machines, the data, the energy infrastructure, and the algorithms increasingly concentrates in a small number of hands. And that concentration is not just financial. It is a concentration of decision-making power over how the rest of society lives, works, and is provided for. This is not a debate between two familiar political ideologies. It is closer to a new alignment between advanced technology companies and the state apparatus that regulates and, in many cases, depends on them. It is worth being precise about what the actual risk is here, because it is easy to get distracted by science fiction versions of this story. The immediate danger is not a machine spontaneously deciding to seize control of civilization. The more grounded and more likely risk is that the humans who already hold enormous power use increasingly capable AI systems to lock that power in more permanently than was ever possible before. Historically, power has been checked, at least partially, by the fact that leaders still needed large numbers of other people to cooperate, to work, to fight, to buy, to vote. Remove that dependency, and a major natural check on concentrated power weakens considerably. A ruling class that no longer needs mass participation has less structural incentive to keep the systems open, transparent, or broadly empowering, because an informed and capable population becomes a rounding error to their bottom line rather than a resource they must court. As this continues to mature, expect the physical geography of value creation and the physical geography of where most people actually live to drift apart. Advanced computation, energy, production, and resource extraction increasingly happen in extreme or remote environments, deep sea operations, polar regions, orbital infrastructure, and eventually locations further out. These are not places ordinary daily life touches, which means the frontier where wealth and technological power are actually being generated becomes less and less visible to the average person, even as its consequences continue to shape their daily reality. Most of humanity risks becoming a kind of managed legacy population, provided for to whatever extent is convenient, but increasingly disconnected from where the real decisions and the real upside are happening. None of that is inevitable for any individual person, even if the broad structural trend is real. There is a meaningful difference between describing a system-level trajectory and telling a specific human being their outcome is already decided. It is not, but the honest version of this conversation requires admitting that passivity is now genuinely expensive in a way it was not a decade ago. Waiting to see what happens is itself a choice, and in a period of structural transition, it is usually the worst one available, because the people who move early into new positions tend to define the terms for everyone who moves later. So what actually shifts the odds in your favor? The clearest lever, historically and right now, is ownership rather than pure labor income. Wages get renegotiated constantly by whoever controls capital and technology. Equity in productive assets does not get renegotiated the same way because you are the one holding the claim. Since the 1960s, the share of national income going to labor has steadily declined relative to the share going to capital, meaning that owners of assets have consistently captured more of the economic gains than workers have, even during periods of strong growth. That trend line predates the current AI moment by decades, and AI is positioned to accelerate rather than reverse it. Anyone whose entire financial position depends on being paid for hours worked is standing on ground that has been quietly eroding for 2 generations, and the erosion is speeding up. Practically, this means treating asset acquisition as a primary financial goal rather than an afterthought you get to once the bills are paid. That can mean equity in a business, real property, infrastructure, or durable intellectual assets, things that generate value independent of you personally trading hours for dollars. It also means being deliberate about converting irregular spikes of income, a bonus, a good year, a windfall, into long-duration ownership rather than lifestyle spending, because ownership is what continues producing value whether or not you personally show up to work that day. This is a different mindset than simply working harder. Working harder inside a purely wage-based structure has diminishing returns, precisely because the structure itself is being devalued underneath you. The second lever is skill, but a specific kind of skill. Generic effort is being commoditized rapidly. What holds value is the ability to direct, evaluate, and combine powerful tools effectively, essentially becoming someone who can supervise and extract a high-quality output from AI systems, rather than someone competing directly against them at the same task. That distinction matters enormously. A person who treats AI as a threat to avoid tends to get displaced by it. A person who treats it as a lever to operate tends to become dramatically more productive per hour, which is exactly the kind of output that remains genuinely scarce and valuable even in an automated economy. Practically, that means actively pushing to use these tools inside whatever work you currently do, asking directly for access, training, and time to integrate them, rather than waiting for a formal program to hand it to you. The third lever is who you are structurally connected to. There has been a long cultural push toward being an independent operator, a personal brand, a solo creator or freelancer, answering to no one. In a period of concentrating power, that independence can quietly become a liability rather than an asset, because a single individual has very little leverage against large, well-capitalized AI-equipped organizations. Being embedded inside durable networks, whether that is a firm, a partnership structure, a cooperative, or a tightly aligned group that collectively controls assets and knows how to operate them, provides a kind of structural protection that pure solo effort does not. Isolation is efficient when times are stable. It is fragile when the underlying rules of the economy are being rewritten. It is also worth being specific about the kind of work that tends to resist automation longest, at least for a meaningful window of time. Highly localized, relationship-dependent, physically embedded businesses, the kind that require being present in a specific community, building specific trust, and navigating specific regulatory or logistical friction, are considerably harder for a purely digital system to replicate quickly. That does not make them automation-proof forever, but it does make them a more durable place to build ownership than a role that consists entirely of digitally transferable, easily standardized tasks. The businesses that are boring, local, and operationally messy are, somewhat counterintuitively, some of the more resilient assets to acquire in this environment, precisely because they are harder for a distant algorithm to absorb in one clean sweep. None of this should be mistaken for a guarantee that governments or existing institutions will step in to smooth the transition. The honest assessment is that the people accumulating the most power in this shift already have the resources to move across borders, restructure their operations around favorable jurisdictions, and largely sidestep the reach of any single national government that tries to slow them down. Regulatory frameworks move on a timescale of years. This technology moves on a timescale of months. That mismatch means it would be a mistake to plan your own position around the assumption that policy intervention will arrive in time to protect you, regardless of which political direction you personally favor. That is not cynicism. It is simply matching your planning horizon to the actual speed of the thing you are trying to plan around. Put together, the practical formula is straightforward to state, even though it is not easy to execute. Increase your fluency with these tools first, because that fluency is what increases your earning capacity in the near term. Use that increased earning capacity to acquire ownership stakes rather than lifestyle upgrades, because ownership is what continues to compound after your personal labor stops being the limiting factor. Direct that ownership toward businesses and assets structurally resistant to rapid automation, and toward networks and partnerships rather than pure solo independence, because collective leverage matters more in a concentrating economy than it did in a more evenly distributed one. None of these steps individually guarantees an outcome. Together, repeated consistently over the next few years, they meaningfully change which side of the emerging divide a person is likely to end up on. There is also a psychological dimension to this shift that rarely gets discussed alongside the economic one, and it deserves attention because it shapes how people actually behave under pressure. When a population senses, even vaguely, that its labor is becoming less essential, the natural reaction is not organized resistance. It is quiet disengagement, a kind of learned passivity that sets in long before the economic numbers fully confirm what people already feel in their gut. That psychological drift is dangerous precisely because it accelerates the very outcome people are afraid of. A workforce that assumes its position is already lost, stops fighting for leverage, stops negotiating, stops acquiring the skills that would have kept it relevant, and in doing so, helps write the ending it was worried about in the first place. Recognizing that dynamic in yourself is often the first practical step, because the instinct to disengage feels like realism when it is actually surrender dressed up as pragmatism. It helps to name the pressures operating at once, because none of them alone would be enough to force this kind of structural change, but together they compound. There is a financial pressure, where the cost of AI capability keeps falling while the cost of human labor keeps rising, making the substitution economically rational for almost any company under competitive pressure to cut costs. There is an infrastructure pressure, where energy, compute, and data increasingly get allocated toward machine systems ahead of human-serving uses, visible in something as mundane as a rising electricity bill. And there is the psychological pressure just described, where populations quietly adjust their own expectations downward before institutions ever have to force the issue. when financial incentive, infrastructure allocation, and psychological resignation move in the same direction, simultaneously, the resulting shift moves faster than any single one of those pressures could produce on its own. That convergence, more than any single dramatic headline, is what makes this moment different from earlier waves of technological anxiety that eventually passed without reshaping the whole economy. It is also worth looking honestly at who actually controls the pace of this transition, because it is not an anonymous, faceless process. A small number of well-capitalized organizations control the most advanced compute clusters, the largest proprietary datasets, and the capital required to keep scaling both. Decisions made inside a handful of boardrooms about how fast to deploy. Automation, which roles to eliminate first, and how much of the resulting savings to reinvest versus distribute to shareholders, have an outsized effect on how this plays out for millions of people who never get a vote in that room. That gap between the concentrated decision-making structure and the diffuse population affected by those decisions is itself part of the story. It is not a natural force of nature unfolding on its own schedule. It is the aggregate result of specific choices made by specific institutions responding to specific competitive incentives, which means the outcome, while difficult to fight individually, is not some inevitable law of physics either. It is a set of decisions, and decisions can, in principle, be influenced, even if influencing them from an individual position is genuinely hard. There are also historical parallels worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as loose analogy. The transition from agricultural labor to industrial labor displaced the majority of the workforce over roughly a century, and it was genuinely brutal for the generation caught in the middle of it, even though it eventually produced higher aggregate living standards decades later. The people who suffered most during that transition were disproportionately those who had no assets, no transferable skills, and no ability to relocate toward where new opportunity was concentrating. The people who came out ahead were disproportionately those who managed to acquire land, capital, or specialized skill before the old system fully collapsed underneath them. The current transition is compressing a similarly scaled disruption into a window of years instead of a century, which means the margin for error and the time available to reposition before the old system stops supporting you is dramatically smaller than it was for previous generations facing a comparable shift. None of this means every job disappears at the same pace or that every sector is equally exposed. Roles built around routine cognitive tasks, standardized writing, basic analysis, first-pass coding, and repetitive customer interaction are exposed earliest and most directly because those are precisely the tasks current AI systems already handle competently. Roles built around physical presence, deep trust, regulatory complexity, or highly localized judgment tend to be exposed later, not because they are permanently safe, but because the economics of replacing them take longer to become favorable. Understanding where a given skill set sits on that spectrum is a useful diagnostic exercise for anyone trying to figure out how much runway they realistically have before their current position starts eroding in a serious way, and it should shape how urgently a person moves on the ownership and skill acquisition steps described earlier. It is fair to ask whether this whole picture is simply alarmist. Skepticism is warranted, and some of the most extreme timelines circulating publicly probably will not play out exactly as stated, because complex economic systems rarely move in perfectly straight lines. But the underlying direction, more computing power, translating into more capable systems translating into displaced labor demand translating into a widening gap between those who own productive assets and those who only sell their time, is not a fringe theory. It is the visible trajectory of trends that have been building for well over a century, now accelerating on a compressed timeline that gives people far less room to adjust gradually than previous generations had. That compression is really the core of the urgency, not doom for its own sake. Earlier technological transitions, industrialization, the shift to electrification, the rise of computing itself, unfolded over multiple decades, giving workforces and institutions time to slowly retrain, relocate, and rebuild around the new reality. This transition is compressing a similar magnitude of disruption into a window measured in years rather than decades. That does not leave much margin for waiting to see how things shake out before acting. It rewards people who start repositioning early, even imperfectly, over people who wait for certainty that will not arrive in time to matter. The comforting version of this story would say that things will stabilize, that new jobs will simply appear to replace the old ones the way they always have before, and that ordinary effort will keep being enough to secure a decent life. That has been true across most of the last 2 centuries of technological change, which is exactly why so many people are still operating on that assumption today. But the honest read of where compute, capital, and automation are currently heading suggests this cycle behaves differently, not necessarily worse in every sense, but structurally different in how narrowly the resulting gains are likely to be distributed unless individuals actively position themselves to capture a piece of that upside directly. There is one more distinction worth making before closing this out, because it changes how a person should actually feel about all of this rather than just how they should act. There is a real difference between a system-level trend and a personal sentence. The structural forces described here are genuinely reshaping the broader economy, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But structural forces describe aggregate outcomes across millions of people, not a fixed result for any single individual willing to move early and deliberately. Plenty of people positioned themselves well during the industrial transition, despite starting with very little, and plenty of people with substantial starting advantages still ended up worse off because they assumed their position was permanent and stopped adapting. The trend sets the terrain. It does not, by itself, decide where any specific person ends up standing on that terrain 3 or 5 years from now. That distinction matters because the temptation, once you actually absorb how fast compute has scaled and how quickly labor's share of income has been sliding, is to swing toward either denial or fatalism, both of which lead to the same passive outcome. Denial says none of this is really happening, and normal effort will keep working the way it always has. Fatalism says it is already too late, and nothing an individual does will matter against forces this large. Both conclusions conveniently let a person off the hook from doing the uncomfortable work of repositioning, which is exactly why both are so common and so persistently comfortable, even though neither one holds up against the actual evidence sitting in front of anyone willing to look closely at it. The more accurate frame sits uncomfortably in between those two extremes. The system is shifting in a direction that structurally favors owners of assets, controllers of infrastructure, and people fluent enough with these tools to direct them rather than compete against them. That shift is large, it is accelerating, and it is not going to reverse itself out of fairness or nostalgia for how the economy used to be organized. At the same time, the shift is not yet finished, the window to move is not yet closed, and the specific position any individual ends up in 3 to 5 years still depends heavily on decisions being made right now this year about skill acquisition, ownership, and the kinds of durable relationships and organizations a person chooses to align with. That is the actual choice sitting in front of most people over the next few years, not whether artificial intelligence will keep advancing, because it clearly will, but whether they spend that window purely renting out their time inside a structure that needs less and less of it, or start converting whatever leverage they currently have, skill, income, relationships, local knowledge, into durable ownership before the terms of that conversion get worse. The compute curve that opened this conversation is not slowing down. Neither is the redistribution of value. It is quietly driving underneath the surface of everyday headlines. The only real variable left is how many people notice in time to do something about their own position before the window narrows further.